The Montreal Screwjob is one of the most significant moments in wrestling history. You can tell by this mountain of YouTube videos talking about it. The culmination of a deeply personal, real-life rivalry between two diametrically opposed titans of the wrestling industry, each with their own claim to being the best of all time, intertwining with corporate backstabbing to create a moment that would send shockwaves through the very fabric of the wrestling business. The Screwjob's short-term impact was immense, but what about the long-term effect? What about the ripples this moment caused throughout the professional wrestling timeline? This moment of personal and professional betrayal couldn't possibly have set in place a chain of events leading to a WrestleMania main event that WWE themselves were made to put on against their will 17 years later. Or could it? I'm Tempest from WrestleTalk, and this is how the Montreal Screwjob led to Daniel Bryan main eventing WrestleMania. Now, I know everyone and their dog knows about the Montreal Screwjob, again, the mountain, so let's knock out the need-to-know content in a lightning round. The mid-90s saw the rise of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels in the WWF, and with that rise came the disintegration of their personal relationship. On one hand, you had Bret the Hitman Hart, who took the business very seriously and wanted to be shown respect by his peers. On the other, you had the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, who made going to work about as much fun as shaving your taint with a cactus. So that dynamic wasn't going to work. Bret has claimed that many of their early altercations were done on purpose to drum up rumors of heat between the two, but by 1997 they had worked that work and worked themselves into a shoot. Shawn went on Raw and implied Bret was having an affair with WWF diva Sunny, which both parties have denied, but with a few million people watching and practically no internet at the time, fans thought they were getting some piping hot goss straight from the source. Bret and Shawn got into a real-life fight the next week in Hartford, Shawn got a chunk of his hair ripped out, and Jim Cornette kept it for his personal wrestling collection. What a normal business this is indeed. With the two top stars of the era seemingly content to tear one another apart, we must now introduce the third character of this story, Vince McMahon. With pressure mounting from WCW, Vince signed Bret to a 20-year contract in 1996, a deal that would have kept Bret employed by WWE until 2016. Imagine Bret wrestling the likes of the SmackDown 6 in WWE in 2002, or battling John Cena in 2005. That was the future we were meant to receive, but by 1997, Vince was no longer able to honor that contract because the money was getting tight. The only problem with that is that there was a clause in Bret's contract that gave him complete creative control over his character for the last 30 days of his run if he chose to leave. Computer, define clause for me.
A clause is a specific point or provision in a law or legal document.
You see, those words law and legal mean you aren't supposed to break a clause like this one. Ah, well, so long as the WWF doesn't fall on hard times, meaning Vince can't honor that contract and Bret ends up set to go to WCW, and also Vince doesn't think to take the WWF title off him before the last show, everything should be fine. What is wrong with this man? So that is exactly what ends up happening, and in a stroke of genius, Vince told Bret that he would be dropping the title to Shawn Michaels, to which Bret replied, So then Vince went to Shawn and said, well then I guess Bret will have to beat you, and Shawn said, nuh-uh. So Vince was stuck between and nuh-uh, and decided to just forget that creative control clause existed, which again, I must reiterate, is f***ing illegal. But who cares about the law? Bing bang boom, Shawn beats Bret with the sharpshooter, Bret doesn't tap out and gets shipped off to WCW a martyr, and Montreal would be doomed to relive finishes at every pay-per-view they would ever get again. Well, that might have been the longest lightning round ever, but now we are caught up and we're ready to take this mountain and put a little tree on top. With the legend of the Montreal Screwjob born, this tree starts with 3 branches. Bret goes to WCW, the Mr. McMahon character is introduced, and Shawn Michaels ventures forth as WWE Champion. But Tempest, how does this have anything to do with Daniel Bryan? Patience! Take this journey with me. Bret Hart, possibly the best in-ring performer in North America, and by far the hottest wrestling property in the world at the time, strolled into WCW, fresh off being made a martyr by his former employer, and was made to be the guest referee in a match between Larry Zbyszko and Eric Bischoff, and then restart the main event between Hulk Hogan and Sting. A match that didn't need restarting because Nick Patrick's quote-unquote fast count was the speed of any other referee's regular count. That's what happens when Nick Patrick usually counts like...
One.
Yeah, it wasn't off to a great start. Even without Nick Patrick being the worst referee in history, this was a massive waste of Bret Hart and the ludicrous amount of momentum and buzz he had upon his debut. And unfortunately for the Hart family, Bret wasn't the only one wasted. At the time of Bret's departure from the WWE, he was part of the Hart Foundation, and given what had just happened to their leader and family member, the rest of the group felt like someone had pissed in their Molson. Of the 3 remaining members of the group, the ones that joined Bret in WCW were Jim the Anvil Neidhart and the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith. Neidhart was never pushed in the promotion, later expressing regret about making the jump to WCW, and was ultimately released in 1998. Following said release, Neidhart became semi-retired, wrestling sporadically until his final match in 2010. The British Bulldog is a bit more complicated. See, at Fall Brawl 1998, the Warrior was set to make a grand entrance through the ring during the War Games main event, a main event that remains to this day one of the single worst matches I have ever seen in my life, so that should tell you if what I'm about to tell you was worth it. WCW had fashioned a trap door of sorts for Warrior to use to enter the ring, but the door had hinges and mechanisms that people were landing on all night. One of the unlucky souls was the Bulldog, who suffered such damage to his back from bumping on the door that he developed a staph infection that left him hospitalized and ultimately addicted to morphine. While he was in the hospital, Bulldog was fired from WCW, just to remind you that WCW was a shitty company run by particularly shitty people. Following that release, Bulldog returned to the WWE for one final run, the one where he wore jeans, before being released in 2000. As for Bret himself, he slipped down the card in WCW rather quickly, becoming the NWO Recruiter in April of 1998 and the United States Champion in July. Bret eventually would become WCW Champion, defeating Chris Benoit at Mayhem 1999 in Toronto, which is good, but that did mean Bret was on a collision course with Bill Goldberg at Starrcade. That's bad. Ask Bret, he'll tell you about it. This would be the match where Goldberg would deliver a stiff kick to Bret's head, a kick that would give Bret a concussion so bad that it would prove to be the end of his career, as he was forced to retire and was subsequently released by WCW in October of 2000. The hard times were not over for Bret, as he suffered a stroke in 2002 that, if for nothing else, allowed him to reconcile with Vince McMahon, who called Bret in the hospital and patched up their relationship. Following this reconciliation and Bret's recovery, he would make his first WWE appearance in 9 years when he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame by Steve Austin in 2006. Now, Bret's branch is nearly wrapped up, but we will return to this in just a hot second. On the opposite side of this here tree, we have everyone's favorite 90s co-worker Shawn Michaels. Shawn, now holding the WWE Championship in the wake of the Montreal Screwjob, was positioned at the top of the card leading into WrestleMania 14, and as a result, was scheduled to defend said championship against The Undertaker in a casket match at the Royal Rumble. This encounter may seem like just another match in Taker and Michaels' storied rivalry, but in reality, this fateful night changed the trajectory of Shawn's career entirely. While Shawn managed to retain his title thanks to Kane, the real story of the match was what he lost. See, in the early goings of the match, The Undertaker pitched Shawn Michaels over the top rope with his lower back striking the edge of the casket, in what has gone down as probably the least painful looking move that resulted in the most catastrophically painful injury ever. Shawn herniated 2 discs in his back and crushed a 3rd one. I mean, seriously, it looked like... Hell of a dynamite that was. Shall we get lunch?
Let's do it. Let's go.
All right. What are you doing? Come on, let's go.
Can't.
Why?
Back broken.
Man, quit playing around. Come on, let's go get lunch. Shawn's career now seemingly had a ticking clock, rapidly approaching 0 attached to it, and after dropping the title to Steve Austin at Mania 14, he retired to his home in Texas, but that doesn't mean he was done with wrestling. In an effort to remain active in and around the business, HBK opened the Shawn Michaels Wrestling Academy, and this is where the little sprout that is the Montreal Screwjob properly starts to branch out more and more, affecting the wrestling landscape for years to come. While it is entirely possible that each of these men would have found a place to train and ultimately be successful, this is the timeline that we live in, and this is the information that is present. If you want to theorize about alternate timelines where all of these events are different and ponder who would have reached their destined places in the universe, you can go for it, but that is a video for another time. As history stands, among the many to make their way through the Shawn Michaels Wrestling Academy, most fans will recognize Lance Cade, Brian Kendrick, Paul London, and a young man named Bryan Lloyd Danielson. Going down the line here, Lance Cade wrestled on the Indies and in Japan until signing with WWE in 2001. He made his Raw debut wrestling as Garrison Cade, defeating Lance Storm with some distraction help from Steve Austin calling Storm boring. WWE actively trying to tell their fans that one of their wrestlers is actually not entertaining and shouldn't be cared about. I wonder if this brilliant idea could possibly come up again in this story. Cade would go on to team with Mark Jindrak in a partnership I sure as don't remember. Do you remember it? I don't remember it. They wrestled at WrestleMania 20? Son of a bitch. Cade was sent back to Ohio Valley Wrestling in 2005 before returning to Raw alongside Trevor Murdoch later in the year. The two were a solid team who actually won the World Tag Team Championship 3 separate times, lasting until 2008 when WWE broke them up because WWE hates to tag teams. Cade had a brief partnership with Chris Jericho in 2008, even feuding with former mentor Shawn Michaels, but was fired over his issues with drugs. He would later work for All Japan Pro Wrestling before his unfortunate and untimely passing in 2010 as a result of heart failure. These next two are often remembered together in Paul London and Brian Kendrick. Kendrick had many stints with WWE early in his career, being signed in 2000 and released in 2001, before bouncing between WWE and Ring of Honor several times, eventually settling in WWE in 2005. London had a more direct route, wrestling for Ring of Honor and TNA before signing with WWE in 2003. He would team with Billy Kidman on SmackDown, winning the WWE Tag Team Championship and later captured the Cruiserweight title as a singles competitor. London and Kendrick then formed their bizarre opera mask-wearing Run Real Fast to the Ring tag team in late 2005 and continued on winning titles before splitting up in 2008 because WWE hates the tag teams. London would soon be released with his last match in WWE coming against Lance Cade, interestingly enough, and would continue to work on the indies, making appearances in Ring of Honor and Lucha Underground. Meanwhile, Brian Kendrick had a brief singles run as a heel, which most people remember for having him hold the WWE Championship for about 5 minutes, unofficially, in that weird-ass Unforgiven Championship Scramble match. Remember that? Wasn't that dumb? He also introduced the world to future ECW champion Ezekiel Jackson before he was released as well in 2009. He signed with TNA before eventually being released in 2012 and making his way back to WWE in 2015, appearing in the Cruiserweight Classic before moving to 205 Live. He would ultimately request and be granted his release from WWE in early 2022 after having worked as a producer and trainer. And then you finally have Daniel Bryan Danielson, the American Dragon, the Yes Man, the man half of this video title and concept is dedicated to. After a brief run in WWE Developmental in 2000 and 2001, Bryan wrestled all over the world, becoming IWGP Junior Tag Champion alongside Christopher Daniels in New Japan Pro Wrestling, and one of the founding fathers of Ring of Honor, reigning as ROH World Champion for 460 days. It was at this time that Bryan became one of the greatest wrestlers in the history of the industry, having classic rivalries with the likes of Nigel McGuinness, Chris Hero, Samoa Joe, and Takeshi Morishima. After years in ROH, Bryan signed with WWE in 2009, where he was immediately packaged as a quote-unquote rookie assigned to The Miz on the first season of Game Show NXT, before arriving on Raw with the Nexus. While he was fired for choking Justin Roberts with his tie and spitting on John Cena, he was hired back just 2 months later. Improbably, Bryan would go on to win the Money in the Bank ladder match the following year in 2011, securing a shot at the World Heavyweight Championship. Bryan has said he was picked to win the match over Cody Rhodes and Wade Barrett so as to not have two heels winning the briefcases on the same pay-per-view, with notable prick Alberto Del Rio set to win the briefcase's red counterpart. Given that the Money in the Bank contract was essentially a golden ticket at the time, this decision likely had a huge impact on both Rhodes and Barrett's careers, as Wade would never become world champion in the promotion and Cody would need to go on a 13-year odyssey before the gold would reach his grasp. I won't go into detail on how Cody Rhodes not winning the world title in 2011 could have possibly led to his departure from WWE and the introduction of AEW, because this video simply cannot be allowed to be 2 hours long, but just know it is implied. Back to Bryan, he cashed in the contract to defeat Big Show at TLC 2011 to capture his first world title in WWE. He would soon turn heel through the very chant that would ultimately be his symbol of success, as the now famous Yes chants would begin simply as a way to over-celebrate victories, eventually turning the fans against Bryan out of sheer annoyance. After an 18-second loss at WrestleMania 28 got the fans behind him, an entertaining storyline in partnership with Kane turned Bryan back into being a babyface. However, this is where we must hit pause and tell this branch to stop growing quite so quickly. Don't worry, I'll remember to water you, tree. We just need a little bit more context first. Back to Shawn Michaels himself, Shawn eventually left the Academy to return to a WWE ring in 2002 after finding his faith in God. To quote a wise man named Jeff Hardy, "Praise the Lord, yeah!" He had his first WWE match in 4 years against Triple H at SummerSlam, and the Heartbreak Kid was off and running. Over the next few years, Shawn had a number of classic rivalries against Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, and Hulk Hogan. Okay, well maybe that last one was a classic for the wrong reasons, but a classic nonetheless. In a positive moment, it did include a segment that must be brought up, as Shawn returned to the scene of the crime on Raw to taunt Montreal 8 years after he screwed Bret Hart. The "Who's Your Daddy, Montreal" promo is one of the best in Raw history and includes one of the loudest pops ever when Shawn tricked the fans into thinking Bret had returned. Stick your decibel meter on that one, WWE. Now, before we go any further, we do have one final branch of this tree to discuss: Vincent Kennedy McMahon, and it is here where the Montreal Screwjob caused the most change, short-term and long-term. As I previously mentioned, Vince screwing Bret introduced him as an on-screen character to the WWE audience. Before this, he was just an announcer, and a bad one at that. But after the Screwjob and a promo saying that what had happened to the Hitman was no one's fault but his, he was an evil millionaire out to make the lives of his workers hell. Really didn't need to do much acting on that one. Thankfully for the blue-collar viewing audience at home, this coincided perfectly with the ascent of one big, bald, beer-drinking badass bionic redneck named Steve Austin. Does Austin still become one of the biggest stars in the history of wrestling without his narrative foil? Probably. He was about as undeniable as a pro wrestler could ever be at the time, but it likely would have been seen by a lot less people. It cannot be overstated how important the Austin versus McMahon rivalry was to both men's careers and the rapid growth of the WWE as the 90s came to a close. But more importantly for us, it gave us a new set of branches to look at. As a result of this feud, we had Vince McMahon stepping into the ring, the introduction of Shane McMahon as a character, and the introduction of Stephanie McMahon as a character. And, well, Linda, but she doesn't matter. Vince in the ring was a sight to behold, as he was about as coordinated as a drunken giraffe on ice skates, and that's before he's trying to do a bunch of choreographed spots, but it did get people watching, pulling in one of the highest ratings for a Raw segment ever in his promoted match with Steve Austin, and a tremendous buy rate for St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where he and Austin had their climactic cage match. His matches were numerous during the Attitude Era, clashing with Austin, The Rock, and others until he battled Shane at WrestleMania X7. Speaking of Shane, he really became a character with the introduction of the Corporation in 1998. He wrestled sporadically, working with Steve Blackman at SummerSlam 2000 before facing his Faja in 2001. Stephanie McMahon, however, is perhaps the most interesting. Stephanie was introduced as a character in 1999, and later that year was infamously drugged and married against her will to Triple H. Or so we thought. Really, Stephanie had sided with her new husband and turned on her father to start the McMahon-Helmsley regime. Doesn't have the same kind of ring to it. It feels like an authoritative group like that should have a one-word name, but golly gosh, I just can't think of one. But what started as your typical wacky Attitude Era storyline would soon turn into much, much more. Now, if you believe in fate, you will probably say Triple H and Stephanie McMahon would have fallen in love no matter what, but without the two being put on TV together and seeing their sparks fly up close, I think it is far less likely. So, after McMahon family warfare taking place for over a year and a half, the popularity created by seeing Austin take down Vince McMahon, and the colossal meltdown that was WCW in 1999 and 2000 gave WWE the push to win the Monday Night War. If you want to hear more on that subject, perhaps you should take a gander at our in-depth look at who really killed WCW. The link will be in the description below. The fall of WCW gave birth to the horribly botched Invasion storyline, and as WWE began to move into the Ruthless Aggression era, we continued to see the McMahons featured as semi-regular in-ring competitors, with Vince having rivalries with the likes of Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan, while Shane took on Eric Bischoff and Kane. Meanwhile, we catch up with our third McMahon branch, who, despite breaking up on television, married Triple H IRL for realsies in 2003. Stephanie would continue to serve as an on-screen authority figure, primarily on SmackDown, while Triple H's reign of terror went down on Raw. For most of the 2000s, Triple H crushed the hopes of young stars such as Rob Van Dam, The Hurricane, Booker T, Jeff Hardy, The Highlanders, Lance Cade, Trevor Murdoch, Paul London, Brian Kendrick. Amidst his reign of terror, all of these branches converged for a D-Generation X reunion rivalry with the McMahons, but this time, rather than DX trying to start a movement and change the way the business was presented, they were like, and then I had to go sideways so that the doctor could pull it out again. It was really weird, you know?
Yeah.
Wouldn't recommend.
Hey guys, it's me, Triple H.
Yeah, we know. Who else would you be?
You know that Vince guy? I hear he likes, penis.
So?
Like, it's 2024, man.
Yeah. You know, Triple H, I think that's pretty homophobic.
I think you're homophobic.
I hate that guy. Anyway, after DX got done beating up Triple H's father-in-law and brother-in-law, the McMahons came together with Triple H to fight Randy Orton in 2009. Orton punted both male McMahons before RKOing, DDTing, and kissing Stephanie in a moment that has way too many views on WWE's YouTube channel. Have some shame, I beg of you, en route to a dreadfully boring loss to Triple H at WrestleMania 25. This was Shane's final WWE program for 7 years, as he decided to quit WWE in 2009. Meanwhile, this Orton feud led to another DX reunion, as Shawn and Hunter took down Orton's lackeys Ted DiBiase and notable future not Money in the Bank winner Cody Rhodes. It was around this time that our dear friend Bret Hart, yes, I haven't forgotten about you, Bret, made his long-awaited return to WWE television. After over 12 years, Bret and Shawn stood in the ring and buried the hatchet, putting their decades-old rivalry to rest. But while they had reconciled in real life, on screen, Vince McMahon was not so quick to embrace Bret, and the two had a terrible match at WrestleMania 26. While not the brightest moment of either man's run, this match effectively put a stamp on both of their in-ring careers. That'll prune the branch belonging to Bret Hart and his journey following Montreal, but on the very same show, Shawn also performed his swan song, retiring after another loss to The Undertaker in the main event. We now enter the final chapter of our story, as we get to one very important moment that would never have happened if not for that fateful night in Montreal: Triple H becoming an on-screen authority figure in 2011. He could very easily have had a long and successful in-ring career without having married Stephanie McMahon, no doubt, but he isn't going to become the chief operating officer otherwise. 2 years later, all of our remaining branches converged again as Triple H turned heel, costing Daniel Bryan his newly won WWE Championship at SummerSlam 2013, in a moment that seemed destined to culminate at WrestleMania, but was bafflingly never planned as such. Bryan's popularity exploded following SummerSlam, and WWE could not seem to keep him away from the main event despite their best efforts. Additionally, Bryan himself has listed CM Punk leaving WWE in 2014 and Batista getting booed so vociferously at the Royal Rumble as factors responsible for him getting pushed, as Punk was scheduled to face Triple H and Batista was to main event against Randy Orton at WrestleMania 30. This left Triple H without a WrestleMania dance partner, and you can't have that, while the main event was missing a babyface for the fans to get behind. Sure enough, at WrestleMania 30, Bryan defeated Triple H to gain entry into the main event, where he submitted Batista to win the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. And with that, you can see how one match in November of 1997 led to all of this. Of course, you could take this further and discuss the Authority's rivalries with Sting, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and Ronda Rousey as well, but this seems like a good place to stop for today. And that does it. I thank you all for watching, as this is a video that I have been wanting to share with you all for over 4 years, and now it's been made. And that's pretty cool. I'd like to thank Steve Dangle, whose Hockey Trade Tree videos provided the inspiration for this format, so if you have any interest in the game of my people, make sure you check out his content at Steve Dangle and SDPN on YouTube. Make sure to let us know of any ideas for future ripple effects you would like to see down in the comments, and always remember to be excellent to each other.
It's a question as old as time itself. Well, at least since March of 2001 anyway. Who killed WCW? WCW closed its doors on March 26th, 2001, after being purchased by its fiercest rival, the World Wrestling